Hi everyone, this is Lulu from As You Wish Pottery. In this video, we'll be painting this gorgeous one-line drawing inspired by our mothers. So let's get started, alright? So we're going to begin by mixing a little bit of Nutty For You with some water. I'm using a plastic cup, so any plastic cup will be just fine. I'm pouring just a little bit of water in there. You see about how much I have going on. No more than 1 to 2 ounces at best. And then I'm gonna stir in my little Nutty For You. I'm just pouring in a little bit, stirring the paint really well until it becomes really watery. I'm stirring it with my medium brush. Then I'm gonna pour it over my platter, and I'm gonna use both of my hands, and I'm gonna run the paint around the platter. I'm gonna make sure that everything gets covered by it. As you see towards the edges, I'm being a little bit more careful just because I don't want my paint to drip. It's gonna drip a little bit, but I just don't want it to become a big old mess, right? So I'm just pouring around, I'm rotating my platter. You see all the paint is getting absorbed by the pottery, and that's what I'm looking for. Then I'm gonna pour out any excess, and I'm gonna use my medium brush, and I'm just gonna get the edges of my platter. So all I'm doing is just expanding from the center of the platter outward. So I'm making sure that all my edges are nicely painted. I'm stirring that paintbrush in there so that way I collect a lot of that watery paint. After I'm done here, I'm gonna make sure that I go about 2 coats on there, just so that way it resembles the same amount of coats that my platter has on the center itself. So all I'm trying to do is just cover what was not able to be covered by just the pour. Okay, once I'm done, I'm gonna messily paint the background of my platter using my brush. You don't really have to do this is totally optional. I like to sometimes paint the bottom of my platters just because I feel like it gives it a nice finished look, but it's ultimately again up to you. And this is just really messily. I'm trying not to worry too much about coats or anything like that. I'm just making sure that everything has a good one coat layer, just to give it that little bit of a hue. And then after that, I'll move on to the next step. Alrighty, so next we're gonna draw on our piece. So I would suggest that you give your platter about 2 minutes to dry before you continue. And then once it's dry to the touch, grab a pencil and draw the shapes that you see on the sample image, or you can make your own shapes. It's really up to you however you want to do this. If you want to follow along, you can always use the sample image on the lesson plan or at the beginning of this video. And I'm just using a pencil to lightly sketch. Remember, whenever we're doing pencil lines, we want it to be as soft-handed as possible. We're not trying to scratch off any paint. We're just trying to create our design. Also remember that the pencil marks disappear once the piece has been fired. So don't worry if you make too many mistakes. You see, I typically go a few lines until I find my happy medium or a happy spot. So don't stress about them if they don't look perfect. This is just for us to get settled and start on the painting process. Next, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna mix the colors that are going to be painted on the shapes with Nutty For You. I'm gonna use what's left of my cup. So you see, created kind of a big old mess. Make sure to go carefully. Make sure that you mix your paint carefully. I'm gonna stir it really well before I continue. You'll see I'll stop my camera here because I made a little bit of a mess, but I'll carry on the next clip. Here we go. So I'm stirring my paint with water yolk really well, that Nutty For You and water yolk. As you see, it's a little bit more watery than I'd like it to be. So what that means is I'm going to let that dry really well before coats, and then I'm going to go over it like 2 to 3 coats. So even more. So however much paint you can put on there, the better. I don't want it to be translucent. I want it to be as bright as possible. And the reason I'm mixing it with Nutty For You is because I'm trying to tone down the brightness of that level of that paint. I don't want it to be that yolky of a color. I want it to be more of a sandy kind of yellow. So I'm mixing it with Nutty For You, trying to get it to tone down a little bit. And like I said, I'm gonna do about 2 to 3 coats with that medium round brush, but you could also do a medium square brush. Whatever medium brush you got will work just fine. And remember to try to stay within the shapes that you created. This is the perfect time for you to adjust the shapes and make them a little bit more bouncy and round on the edges and things like that. And yeah, and remember to let your coats dry. So that way when you're layering paint on top of one another, the coats soak it in really well, and you can ensure that nothing is see-through and everything is solid as can be. And here, before I carry on, I want to show you guys, I'm doing one more coat. I just want to make sure that I can't see that creamy color as much underneath, you know. And since my paint was so watery, I just want to go over it one more time. And this is just for safety measures. So if you feel like your paint is a little too watery, go ahead and do as many coats as you can. Keep in mind, use all the paint you have. It'll be a-okay after that, okay? All right, so next I'm gonna repeat the same process. I'm gonna mix in a little bit of Nutty For You, but this time I'm gonna be using Peachy Keen as well. And keep in mind, I'm gonna use it the same brush, but before I use it, I'm gonna clean it really, really well before I continue on. I don't want my yellow and my pink to mix. I want these colors to be bright and strong on their own. And remember, since we are mixing a nutty color for a little nutty tan color on them, we want them to stand out and be bright as possible, but just not overly their natural state of brightness. So you'll see that I kind of stir in a little bit more of that Peachy Keen, just in case if that color becomes a little too dark, or if I don't like it as much. It's not the end of the world. I can just stir in a little bit more, or dip my brush in both colors and paint it along. So I'm going to be doing 2 to 3 coats on these two shapes. And remember, you can use the sample to guide you on what shapes to paint, or you can really paint whichever shapes you want. I just try to not paint 2 shapes on the same, like one right next to each other. I try to have a little overlap of another color in between them. So you'll see that I'll do this a lot. I try to give everything a little bit of its own space, so that way all the colors come out bright and colorful, and nothing stands out or nothing overlaps each other. Just remember to do 2 to 3 coats. We want this to be really, really bright, and we want to make sure that those color swatches like show up really well in the background. So once you're done with your 2 to 3 coats, rinse your brush off really well, and let's continue on to the next step. So next we're going to repeat the same thing, but this time we're just going to use a little bit of Nutty For You with pea soup, and we're going to use it for just the biggest shape, or the biggest blob, I would call it, on my platter. So I'm going to use the same brush, stirring it really well, or rinsing it really well before I continue on, and then I'll stir that Nutty For You and pea soup color together really, really well before I continue on. I'm going to paint the circle there. I might adjust that circle, so I like my circles to have more of a circular shape. I don't know what happened there. So I also become very obsessive over circles. So if you're like me, do it, let it dry, and then keep working at it as you're going, okay? And then for this, we're doing 2 to 3 coats again. I'm making sure that my circle looks really circular, and then I'll continue on painting the next blob. And you'll see that I start off with the shapes always. Like, I start off with the outline of the shape itself, and then I go in and I make it, I fill in the rest of it after I got a nice shape going on. Since this color also is sitting right next to the yellow, I'm gonna make sure that that section where those two colors meet is really, really well covered, so that way the yellow isn't showing through on the green later on. Alrighty, so next I'm gonna paint the last shape with just 2 to 3 coats of pea soup, and this one I'm not mixing with anything. I'm just going on and painting it myself. I'm letting that pea soup color be on its own, just to kind of add a little bit of a variant between all the nutty colors, or all the colors that were mixed with the nutty color. So that way this one comes out a little bit brighter. Pea soup is one of my favorite colors, so you'll see that I try to use it whenever I can. And I'm doing about 2 to 3 coats with the same brush. Just remember to rinse it before you change onto another color or anything like that. Or if you're onto this step, make sure that your brush is nice and rinsed. We don't want it to be picking up the other color at all. So next, I'm going to set my platter aside to dry, and then once it has dried for a couple minutes, I will trace on the image. So while the platter is drying, I'm going to grab my printed image from the lesson plan. Then I'm going to go in and I'm going to use tissue paper on top. So I'll put my tissue paper on top of my printed image. Then I will follow along the lines using a pencil. You see I already kind of traced it on, so that way it would be easier for me, but it's really easy. All you got to do is just follow the lines you see using the pencil, and once you're done, we'll transfer it over to the platter. So my platter has dried. You see all the colors have kind of toned down a little bit. They don't look as bright, and everything starts looking kind of pastel-y, and that's a good thing. That means that your platter is dry and we can trace the image. So I'm going to set the image on top of my platter. I'm going to align it there really well. Then I'm going to use a marker and I'm going to follow the lines I see. You can follow along here and do the same thing, or if you wanted to create your own design, you could do that as well using the tissue paper. Or I also included some other designs that you can also ask for. So if you're using another one of the designs, you're more than welcome to follow along the same steps. So it's pretty much tracing it on with a pencil first onto the tissue paper, and then once you are satisfied with that, you'll move on and transfer or retrace it over onto the platter itself. Make sure that your piece is pretty centered, or your piece of paper is pretty centered, so that way your design is straight in the middle, okay? And keep in mind that the marker will disappear after the piece has been fired, so it's okay if it's not perfect. We're not looking for perfect right now. It's just a way for us to have a design down, so that way we can just go in and paint it afterwards. So after I'm done tracing my design, I'm gonna start on the painting of the lines. So keep in mind for this process, I use a detail brush. I prefer the long detail brush. It's just easier to control for me, and I like the lines better. But you can really use any detail brush you have. Just keep in mind though that if you have a thicker detail brush, make sure to just use the very tip of your brush. Pretty much is what I'm gonna do now anyways, using my thin detail. I'm just using the little tippy top of the bristles. So you'll see me loading my brush and also unloading a lot of paint. That just means that I'm not trying to work with a blob. You see there's barely any paint in my brush, but this will just help me have the most control. You'll also see that I added a little bit of water to my paint. So it's just a couple droplets of water. This will just help to thin out the paint a little bit to make it more of the consistency of ink. Black lab tends to be a little dark or a little thick sometimes, so I try to thin it out whenever I can or whenever I'm doing intricate work. And then I like to work from the inside outwards, so as well as like from top to bottom, but you can really go at it however you feel comfortable. Another thing you'll notice is that I move my platter around as I'm working on it, just because I find it easier to move the platter itself than instead of making my hand work for the platter, I'm making the platter work for me. So I'm just trying to get to it whichever way I feel the most comfortable, whichever direction I feel the most comfortable. Remember that you should always hold your piece and work on it in front of you, not kind of laying it down and then just painting on the table itself. If you feel like that's more comfortable for you, that's fine as well. Just find whatever's the most comfortable position. I like to hold my piece at an angle in a way, so that way I can get onto the lines a little bit better and easier, but you could really do it however you like. I also like to work upside down sometimes, just because it helps me get to things with more comfort and more I can get to things that are far away from me easierly or with an easier hand, since it's now towards me. So you'll see that I do things upside down because of that. It just helps get a different advantage point to the design than just working on it far away. So what that means is just finding ways that you don't have to stretch your arm so far away from you, just because the further your hand is from your body, the harder it is for you to control the brush and your hand, you know? So the closer it is to your body, the more control you have, the closer to your core, right? I'm sorry for that ramble, but it's just one of those things. I love detailing and working with the detail line. I also suggest, if you don't feel comfortable outlining it just on the platter just yet, you can also just practice on the piece of paper that's printed. You can follow along the lines and kind of just trace on what the lines that you see there, and just kind of get the handle of the detail brush that you're using, as well as the line work that is involved. Another thing I do too is that I like to start off thin, so I just barely touch the bristles to the pottery, and then once I have the design set, I can go in and thicken up as I go. So this is also another option. I highly suggest you start off thin and then work your way to making things a little thicker. And it's okay if they come out a little thicker. That's totally okay. I think it adds a variance of line weight, and that makes the design look a little bit more personalized and a lot more hand painted than just something that a machine made, right? So don't be afraid to embrace those mistakes or accidents and have fun with it. You know, take everything little by little, break it down into parts if it's easier for you. I don't do something just straight on. I literally break it down. So like, I'm working on the ear now, so I'm gonna finish the whole ear and then I'll move on to the next thing, that kind of thing. So here on out, all I'm doing is outlining my piece. You'll see that I take my time on some sections, whatever feels the most difficult. I kind of try to get the easier parts of that process first, and then go on and do the longer lines or the longer things that I'm a little bit more afraid of. And remember, always start off with your thin lines. I promise you, you can thicken up anything as you go, and that's my easiest way to fix things. It's just to make my line a little thicker. So if you have a little shaky hand or anything like that, that's a-okay. As long as you don't go heavy-handed, you can totally hide that with another coat of paint. so here's a little close-up of our finished project. As you see, all the lines came out really good, and pretty much all of them have different variances in weight. Some of them are thin, some of them are thick, and I'm totally here for that. I'm digging it. I hope you had fun today. Thank you so much for painting with me. Have a great day, and bye-bye.